Hello, everyone. Welcome, you amazing folks in a governance session at the end of the day of Microsoft Ignite. Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. And I want to say a huge shout out to the folks joining us online. This is a truly hybrid, blended audience, and we are happy to be here. So my name is Karen Wanagatimu, and I'm here.
John Gruszczak.
He's here, absolutely. John and I are going to take you through a little bit of a different approach to talking about Microsoft 365 governance. To be fair, this is a 4-hour workshop, right? But what we're going to try to do is have a lot of time for demonstrations, for your questions, and highlighting the core concepts and new information. So we're going to try to just get all that in there together so that you can have the information that you need, but also give you some resources where you can follow up and then continue to ask your questions in the community. Microsoft 365 governance is not the most lightweight of topics, and so we want to make sure you get some of that essential information. As Rick mentioned at the top, for anybody online, but also here in the room, please use this particular content, this QR code here, so that you can get your questions in the queue. We'll try to answer as many of them as we possibly can. I want to land a concept that's really important for everyone in this room before we go any further. Good governance precedes great adoption. This is really important. If you are thinking about how are we going to get people to use it, or oh, maybe too many people are using it, or I'm just concerned about who's using what when, that's because your governance isn't in order. Right? And so even though this is clearly a popular topic for all of you, but maybe in your organizations, when you bring up the word governance, you start to hear people groan. They sneak out of your meetings. They take a cookie and run. They sign off. All of a sudden, they stop being on video. You ever notice that in an online meeting, people turn off their video when certain topics come up? Okay, that's because they associate governance with difficulty and pain. We want to change that. Governance is about having the right guardrails and about freeing people in the right context. So satisfied users and happy self-service IT manageability is what our objective is. And I invite all of you to help us change the brand of governance all around the world to something that is not the thing everyone runs from. Please help me with that. All right, so you're going to need this. Take a picture of this or take a screenshot online, ak.ms Teamwork Governance. This is a reference documentation page that you will need for the future, because as we add new policies, new workloads, new services, this is where we do the updates, right? And as we do AMAs on this topic in our IT Pro community, we always refer back to this. So please make sure you use this. John and I both publish things there. We overview it and make sure everybody is copacetic with it. All right. How many of you here consider yourself IT pros, or you're an IT administrator of a Microsoft 365 tenant? Okay. All right, good. And I know you folks online are as well. I'm not forgetting about you in any way. But there's some other people here in the room as well. And it's really important to think about collaboration governance, not governance of Teams or SharePoint or whatever, right? It's all got to move together, especially the more that we integrate things with the Microsoft 365 app, with Microsoft Teams. There's so much that's happening in the service nowadays that you need to have a more broad-based governance strategy all up that you implement in phases. One of the biggest mistakes I ever saw a customer make was that they went from no governance to complete lockdown control in literally 30 days. That is a surefire way to get people sending documents offline, carrying around little USB sticks, using unauthorized software, and texting stuff on some of our competitors who I won't mention, where you don't want your corporate data, right? If you don't do governance right, you will push people to breach your security because they're trying to get something done. That's why it's important to have smart governance, right, in this particular sort of way. There are some goals around file sharing, shared data and process automation, communications and digital experience, and knowledge sharing. These are the containers of the kind of teamwork governance that you need to architect. One of the fundamental foundational units of this is the Microsoft 365 group. right? Microsoft 365 Groups, it's a membership service. Yes, I know, and I'm sorry, we first launched it as O365 Groups. It's a collaboration experience. I realize that we did that to all of you. I'm sorry. I'll apologize on behalf of Microsoft. We were just trying out new things then, okay? But now what it really is behind the scenes is that membership service that grants people access to resources, whether it's a Power BI dashboard or a team in Teams. And so if you're not thinking of your Microsoft 365 Groups in that way, I invite you to do so, because without doing that, you're going to do a lot of hard work in the governance department. But that is the cornerstone of how you're going to craft these different types of collaboration experiences. Right? And so you want to think about those group identities being in Azure Active Directory. And of course, this is the cloud-based version. Now, obviously, if you have on-prem AD, you'll be doing some syncing, and there's some work to do there. But nonetheless, that group experience is populated into the app of choice, and that long list of apps keeps growing. That is an old list of icons. There's probably 15 more by now. All right. But let's really talk about quickly what's changed. So that's all what you may have already known, or maybe not, about Microsoft 365 governance. What's different now, however, is the fact that you are governing people not in your physical environment. You are governing people's machines when they're calling in from home and working remotely. The hybrid work scenarios are here to stay. And while some organizations are requiring people come back to work, many, many more are not. And so the idea of having the membership right, having identity right, and being able to support people on whatever device they may be using — I have my Duo, I have my iPhone, but both are secure — that requires the broader set of Microsoft technologies, Endpoint Manager, Intune, these other components, right? And so this is why you do it in phases. Maybe the first thing you do is make sure your M365 group governance is in order, and you start there. And then you have people enroll their devices. And then you make sure you have healthy devices, and then you evolve to Zero Trust, right? But it's a journey. So don't leave this session thinking that, oh, you're going to go and turn all this on and make this all work in like a couple of minutes. It's not true, right? It's going to be a journey, and I think John and I can attest to that. So think about how you're governing folks who are in a different or a same place, who are working at the same time or a different time. Right? Even something as simple as the way you name your Microsoft 365 groups and how they show up in the list can make or break your governance and collaboration experience. And so again, list naming, group naming is a pet peeve of mine because, I understand everybody wants prefixes that attach to department names, but please stop doing that. Please stop doing that, because you can't immediately see and understand what it is as a human, right? So it's all about people first. Okay, this is my last slide before I really talk about, hang on one second. What happened to my, okay, well, there's a triangle on there, so you're going to have to take my word for it that there's actually a triangle. It doesn't seem to be showing on my, oh, there, you're seeing it, but just not over here. Great, okay. That was a test to see if I was paying attention to my own slide. So the idea that you need to have different types of governance at different levels in the organization is another important concept. And this is my last slide before we hop into some demonstrations and take some questions. But these things, coping with people in different locations, understanding the full Microsoft stack, and having policies at different levels of collaboration experiences are really the foundational elements of being able to craft a good strategy and then make an execution plan. So for instance, at the workgroup level, it's not as important to have controls that control, how many files are uploaded, or what kind of membership is there. But you might very much want to control whether or not external guests are included. Right? The guest policies you have in your organization are often different depending on the type of group you're in, right? Folks on the manufacturing floor may not ever have the ability to add a guest to a team. But if I work in marketing and I'm collaborating with vendors doing creative, then I need guests to come into that team so that I can effectively work together. I need the control of shared channels in Microsoft Teams where I can choose which organizations I'm going to trust, right, and have those experiences. As you move up in the group experience to departments and divisions, and of course that company level, like Viva Connections, your SharePoint Home, those sorts of hubs and what have you, you have more of a one-to-many. You have a very few number of people who can edit and own things, and a very large amount of people who can consume information. Right? And so that sort of model is one of the things that we're trying to improve, because quite frankly, it's been pretty difficult to keep alignment in the group membership between the SharePoint sites and the teams. And then what if you add an app in there, right? It just gets super complicated, and it hasn't been the easiest thing in the world to manage. So we know that. We've heard that feedback. I've lived that, even just as a program manager inside Microsoft. So I can tell you that we are doing some work to streamline that, and communications, which is the whole point of Viva Amplify, which we announced here at the show. But my key thing here to land with all of you is have different policies for different types of experiences in your Microsoft 365 tenant. One size does not fit all. And you will make happy people and have good adoption if you automate as much of this as possible. So I wanted to land all of that, and now I want to turn it over to John, who's going to show us how some of this actually works, right?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you, John.
And one of the things I love is we probably don't get to work together enough, as much as we maybe like to, but all the key points you hit on resonate super deeply with me when we talk about governance. And one of the things is that you hit on is frictionless, right? And I'm going to start with the security angle of this because, governance goes across many spectrums, but one of them is this idea of work from anywhere, work from any device. Years ago when Ignite was in Orlando, some of you might not know this, but as soon as that Ignite ended, we went on usually a 15 to 20 roadshow tour. And everyone had the expectation is we need to keep working on our content. We need to be working like we're sitting in Redmond, wherever we are. And so that was always an expectation. I'm sure many of you pre-pandemic had that same expectation of global sales forces or regional sales forces. So I'm going to start with access governance. And one of the first things, since there's probably a range of different hats being worn here from different admin sides. The first is, the number one thing is please set up MFA. Please set up multi-factor authentication.
Yes.
Sorry to hit an elephant in the room, but it is starting to being baked into cyber insurance policies, right? And so please, it's a very easy thing to do, and it starts to get this general hygiene with end users that it's an expectation. And you can make it very frictionless using the Authenticator app or whatever your kind of tooling is. But please, 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 we're going to sound like we're beating a dead horse, but it is. MFA, please, is the very first level of access governance that you should have set up. Even if you're internal, even if you're sitting on site and you're coming from a corporate IP address, if I'm accessing sensitive projects that we were about to announce as part of Ignite, we're probably having labeling on there. We're having access policies. You need MFA that you want to pull in. So hopping into some demos to zoom in. The first thing that we'll talk about is we'll look at a conditional access policy. We'll skip over MFA, but just quick show of hands for people in the room. How many of you do use conditional access or some type of access? Oh, look at that.
Look at that. And I'm going to hope that you people at home are raising your hands at your workstation at home. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. And so I won't do a whole lot of stuff here because you're talking about it, we're using we're using high usage, but risk-based conditional access is one thing. I'm just showing a very brief demo here. As Caruana mentioned, this is probably a 5-hour workshop. But in general, start to assign risk, and this is all based on your internal organization, right? IP changes. As simple as, are you coming from a secure device? At Microsoft, we get to use our personal devices, and we use mobile application management. So MSIT is managing the applications. We could still keep our personal stuff on there. But everything we do is still using MFA. Essentially, anytime we're trying to access corporate materials. But that frictionless is key, because I want to be able to use Teams naturally, and I can ping and do everything naturally. But when we start to access, sensitive SharePoint sites or other sensitive materials, we probably want to push an MFA, and we want to do additional checks on that device. Another great thing that I can't show off here, but that has been baked into part of conditional access, is continuous access evaluation. How many of you, want to be inclusive of everyone online, so we'll say everyone knows about CAE, but we're able to provide checks in more real time, right? So we can assess if those properties changed, because we want to trust that all of our end users are not malicious, but sometimes we do get breaches, or we have things going on in the organization that we want to make sure that our security investments are looking out for. And so one of those things is someone quickly changing their IP address, right? Maybe they're trying to spoof who they are, and we are able to sense that this person said they were in the US, and also now we see an IP address coming from somewhere that is not remotely possible. We've identified that that is not that identity. So And I could probably drain this, but from a sign and risk level as well, we'll take a look here. High, medium, low, no risk at all. You can assign these on an application basis, or one of the things we see customers do is apply these to the normal apps you're pushing out. Outlook, SharePoint, Yammer, Teams. And depending on how you collaborate, maybe you need to increase permissions on some of those, maybe you don't. But in general, we see typically Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, Yammer managed together. And so if you've already created those policies, maybe you haven't started rolling out Teams yet, but you had this governance in place, easy enough. As you go through this wizard, you're just going to have a checkbox for Teams. So a lot of the governance, when it comes from the security identity side, is building on what you've already set up for things like Exchange and workloads. So we want to make sure, again, conditional access. I was glad to see the hands here so we can move on to the next item. But that is a very big thing because, again, it even includes on-premises stuff. If you're accessing sensitive materials, we just want to validate that identity, and then we want to let that continuous access evaluation continually assessing that that identity is true and that it is a trusted identity.
And as John goes on to the next topic, I also want to encourage you that if you are new to this, or if you want to try some of these things out, one of the big things that I've had in my kind of back pocket all this time is my own tenant. Right? Even with a lower level license like an E3 or something, get your own tenant so you can go in and play and look at these settings and understand what's available before you are playing around or trying to do work in your production tenant at the office. Right? Now, obviously, some things don't work the same when it's just you as a user, but still, it gives you something to get that hands-on keyboard experience in many cases, especially with some of the baseline capabilities that we're talking about. So if you don't have your own dev or test tenant, I highly recommend investing in that, or have your organization actually have a tenant that's available to you. I know at Microsoft we don't make it 100% easy when it comes to tenant work like that, but it is something that we as IT professionals need to embrace and create in our own organizations.
Fantastic tip. Yes, I've worked with customers that do have pre-prod tenants, and everything gets scaled out there, especially if you're in a regulated industry. Maybe you can't use certain preview features, or you can't just roll things out, and I would double down. I have about 5 tenants I maintain, all with different things going on in them based on demos like this. I will echo that if you want to create conversation, you spend a lot of lonely hours talking with yourself in different personas, but it can be fun when you're traveling. So as we move on to access governance, the next is working with other organizations, right? This is a very common expectation that whether you have partners, vendors, legal departments that are outside the group, working cross-tenant. And so we won't do a whole deep dive on this because this, again, is probably a 12-hour session when you talk about external access, but the first thing is how you want to work with cross-tenant organizations, and so this is essentially shared channels. So hopefully you saw that announcement. You've maybe been in the public preview when that started, and we GA'd it, I believe, July of this year was the official date. And so shared channels are really a great next step when we talk about in any sort of collaboration. Being able to keep things inside of that secure container without having to do tenant switching inside the Teams tenant, which we know can be somewhat burdensome depending on how you are collaborating. You want to have everything in line. And so this is kind of one of the first steps. And again, your organization will have to determine how you want to work and what your kind of allow and deny lists look like for other partner organizations. So in general, if you haven't seen this screen and you do work within the Azure Active Directory Center or you have an identity team, this should be a page that you're going through and kind of assessing how essentially your inbound, outbound, and tenant restrictions are going to work. You see down here at the bottom, I don't have a very inclusive environment here. I block everything, right? And this is just an example for what a super kind of strict and lockdown environment would look like. But as we hop over to the next section here of external collaboration, this is where we start to get into how we're going to manage guests. And one thing I do want to relate here is inside the Teams Admin Center, which I can hop to, there's something called what we call federated access with other organizations and guest access. Those are actually powered through here in Azure Active Directory. They're identity models. And so this is where you're going to manage things. And so here we talk about how we want to manage guests, who can invite guests, guest user access restrictions, invite restrictions, whether we want to enable self-service user flows. And this is one that I think every customer we talk to probably has a different way they want to handle this,
Yeah.
Including Microsoft, right? We are fairly strict at how guests get onboarded and how they're, what type of access level they're able to have. And so this is another area that I love that you mentioned. Sit down with a team of people. This is not something that you want to reactively throw out there and think it's going to be solved. This is something that you should have stakeholders from as many groups as needed. I realize too many cooks in the kitchen could become a problem, but you want to have all of your key decision makers in here that are on SecOps teams, compliance, maybe even legal that you need to consult with. How are you going to allow outside users in? Because that is a key determinant in how you kind of have open collaboration.
And the other piece of that I'll add is, yes, you want IT, SecOps, legal, all those folks at the table, but please also have your sales and marketing leaders, have your business leaders at that table as well. It's very important that these types of policies be a joint decision, because there is a natural tension that is going to come between many business leaders who just want things to be open and IT professionals and legal folks and security who want everything to be closed. The actual way is the middle way, right? It's where you have these policies created by the risk level of the data, right? There are certain teams inside Microsoft that don't allow external guests, period. And there's others that do, because they are labeled appropriately. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. But just make sure that you bring these folks together with an understanding that it's not either or. Both groups can feel confident that the most sensitive data can be protected and be ring-fenced, if you will, and then data where it's really better for the business to have more fluidity and with access for external people, that can also be created. The last thing I'm going to say about that is, early on in my career, before I joined Microsoft, one of the first articles I wrote was how to build a governance committee. And most of that article is still valid 15 years later. But what I would change is I wouldn't call it a governance committee, right? Bring together people around architecting collaboration experience or empowering our business. Like, use different words, I beg of you, because you will get more attention and you will get more traction on making these very important decisions, and you'll get more partnership from people across your business.
That was perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what does this look like? We talked about, again, this is a fairly easy to digest page, but what that starts to lead into is I'll hop into the Teams Admin Center dashboard here. And that's the first thing that we're going to take a look at, is how we manage our collaboration. So the first thing I talked about was federation. External access is what it's actually called by in the identity model behind the scenes. And so external access is that domain-to-domain collaboration. And in most cases, you're going to have this on by default. You're going to be able to work with any organization. And that's typically how Microsoft works as well, is we actually are constantly working, so I use Ping, but IM message via Teams with customers, with analysts, with community experts or MVPs, whoever it may be. And so external access is a key part of working together. But depending on your organization, depending on your industry, you may have different regulations here. And so this is one of the key things, is this drop-down menu here. Whether you're going to allow all external domains, specific external domains, or you can then move to block all or block specific external domains. Again, I'm not going to give away any MSIT secrets, so I'll use Contoso Organization here. But in Contoso Organization, we're an open book, right? We spend a lot of time working with different partners, different communities, whatever it may be, and so we have allow external domains, and we have our additional security and compliance measures in place, things like data loss prevention, communication compliance that we can monitor for data leaks, but we have a very open collaboration environment. And so this is one of the key things. Again, it's a very easy drop-down, a very simplified demo, but this is really another key. I like what you said, don't always have to use governance. Use different terms here, but this is one of the key decisions you'll have to talk through, is how are we going to work with other organizations? Maybe to start, you only want to allow certain domains that you work with and block everyone else. This is a decision that we can't stand up here and make for your organization. This is something you'll want to talk about. Scrolling down, you see the other kind of key thing is whether you're going to allow communication with Skype users. But the next area we move to is guest access. And so in most organizations, you're going to have a need to bring on guests into your organization to be able to access things like Planner or other parts of the team that you want to share resources in. And so this is exactly how you're going to be able to manage guests inside the Teams Admin Center. Again, the identity part is managed inside of Azure Active Directory, that previous page I showed you. But this is going to be specific to Teams. And there's a fairly I don't want to say simplified, but a very upfront, different set of controls that you can set here for how guests are going to have a collaboration experience inside of your environment. So, for instance, most are default left on, and most customers I work with leave the majority of these on. But maybe you want to say that, hey, guests can't edit their messages once they sent. It's a compliance issue. So we could turn that off. And another one would be something, what we call our fun settings, which is one of my favorite things we have in the admin center, but is, Giphy and conversations, the content rating. Maybe you want to say it's very strict. We want to say that, you know what, for right now, we don't use memes, we don't use stickers. Again, very simplified overview here, but these are all internal decisions that you want to figure out how you're going to work with your organization, work with your department leads, marketing experts, legal experts, whoever it may be, understanding what type of access guests have. Because once you roll this out, you start on, you have to understand that a guest in your environment is someone you don't necessarily know. You don't understand what they may be doing, and so it is key to have your kind of restrictions and things set up in place. Otherwise, you'll be working on identifying who are the good guests, who are overstayed their welcome, how do we start to get these people out.
Right. And it's always wise to have people take ownership. One of the best campaigns I think we ever rolled out in MSIT, Microsoft IT, was around each employee has an accountability for security. It's not just IT or the security department. Everybody has an accountability for keeping our data safe. And so we've done things like ask site and team owners to review the guests that have access in that team on a quarterly basis. It doesn't take more than a couple of minutes, but it makes people participate in the process of securing data, right? And it takes that decision out of IT's department, right? And so if you don't renew people, then they will be automatically renewed. But actually, we rolled that process out over the process of a year. First, we got people used to reviewing their guests that they had already granted access to. Then we got them used to the fact that if they didn't go in and grant access, people would be removed. And we did it in a progressive process. So engage your end users, and especially people who are the owners of teams, owners of SharePoint sites, and what have you, and applications as well, to take that sense of ownership about who is accessing that data. Because IT alone or security alone will never be able to secure everything. It's just not humanly possible. So we have to engage an army of educated end users, about this.
Absolutely. I love that because you really do. And the last thing I'll quickly show on the Teams Admin Center side, I realize many of you may have so many teams when this page loads, it's not even feasible to really understand it. But what I do like to say is there's actually some very good things here when you go to the Manage Teams page inside Teams Admin Center that I like to look at. Privacy. And then also, as I scroll over here, it will let you know if there's a sensitivity label applied to me. Those are teams that I'm typically trying to look at from a hygiene perspective to understand what type of guests are in there. Are the roles assigned properly? So this is actually one of the coolest things I think that is good for insights. Again, understand if your organization has 100,000 teams. A little more daunting to look at, but again, I think privacy and sensitivity label here are two very quick, easy ways to identify maybe more sensitive-based teams or content that you want to do a double click in or keep kind of taking a look at.
Right. And also, these things can be set up at the beginning. Now, I know some customers have wanted to do things like either a Power App or a Microsoft form before people are able to provision Teams or SharePoint sites or what have you, because you're trying to gather more information, things of that nature. I understand why you want to do that, and we also don't let you do much to alter that provisioning experience. But what I will say is if you take advantage of some of the capabilities of Microsoft 365, you may not have to do that because you can have group membership be the thing that allows people to provision teams. And that provisioning experience can be altered with the addition of data labels and privacy elements added to it at provisioning. And so one of the things that you'll find on the Teamwork Governance page, but also in this deck, which we'll make sure gets attached to the digital experience, is instructions on how to do that. We have many customers that we work with, we've guided them into customizing that provisioning experience. Because the worst thing that you can do is make someone wait for their team. Because if they have to wait for that team more than the time it takes us to actually create it, they will go find another way to get work done. And you've already created a breach in your security by not meeting their needs when they needed it. So we really ask you to take a look at the capabilities of Microsoft 365 Admin Center, of Azure Active Directory admin capabilities, so that you can customize that experience in ways that, again, at the work group and department level, like those memberships that people get when they become an employee in your company, also set up policies for what collaboration experiences they can use. Right? This becomes even more important as we think about new workloads, but I wanted to make sure. Did you want to do another one here?
No, we'll transition into some broad data governance, so you can, yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to, because there was a question online that I wanted to address, and it's a perfect roll into some of the new workloads. Has anybody out there tried Microsoft Loop yet? A couple of people? Yeah, you got some folks out there. Okay, and I apologize. I keep having people raise their hands in the room. I'm trying to include the folks online as well. But, so Microsoft Loop, I want you to think of that as a collaborative container that's portable, right? Basically, a loop allows you to make a task list, a table, or just a checklist of pieces of information. And you can use it in Teams chat. You can use it in Outlook and email. You can use it on a web page that's coming soon. Right? But the thing is that is governed essentially by OneDrive, right? That's why it's important you have good governance policies in place for OneDrive and SharePoint and what have you. Because we are going to keep delivering more features that leverage that infrastructure, the data governance, the labeling, the retention policies and things of that nature are going to be continuing to expand across Microsoft 365. We have a tremendous investment in that in the SharePoint space, in the Microsoft Syntex space and others, and in the admin centers. So when you think about Loop and Viva and these things, which are pretty new, actually they're extremely new, they may not have all those capabilities now, but neither did Teams when it launched. So 2 years from now, Loop is definitely going to have all of those capabilities. So you have the time to think about how you're integrating them into your system. The second piece of that is about going back to your guest access. The question was about what governs the data if a guest is in a team, essentially, and what happens when there's two competing retention policies or what have you. This goes directly to your collaboration experience. So one of the mistakes I'll say we made when we first launched Teams inside Microsoft is we let our field salespeople make Teams inside our tenant and invite all the customers. Now, that's not a bad thing in theory, but oftentimes the data that's there isn't actually Microsoft's. It isn't ours to govern. It's the customer's data. It's the customer's information. So a better way to have done that would have been to have the customers make the team and invite us, right, rather than the other way around. So because the organization that owns the team, those are the policies that are going to follow that data and that guest membership. Right, so I still have them. I'm still a member of 5 different, you would know their names, like customer teams that are on our tenant. But every time I'm in there, I cringe a little bit because they really shouldn't be there. They should be in the customer's face. But we didn't know that at the beginning. So now all of you have that opportunity. You have maybe sales organizations that want to collaborate with customers, and they should. If that customer's not using Teams, then fine. That's not a problem. Make them on your tenant, but then you have policies that surround the use of that particular team. And that way you have customer experiences that are governed, but also really fast to be able to make decisions, right? You can be on chat with them. You can share a file easily, that sort of thing. And those files should live in SharePoint, not in your OneDrive, not in your sales agent's OneDrive. That's not where they go. They go in the team, in the SharePoint, please.
John's thumb drive.
Yeah, I know, John's thumb drive, not the place to store the corporate data. Okay. Yeah, speaking of data loss prevention.
Yeah, no, I love that.
That was the human element of it.
And especially, as a rule of thumb, please don't take this as the de facto law. As a rule of thumb, host tenant is going to be the governance of the data. So retention, sensitivity, again, always read the detailed documentation for the service that you're working on. But in general, we think of if we're in a host tenant, they're the one that's controlling the data and having to keep the retention policies, whatever it may be associated. So we're going to talk about a couple high-level security items. This is not necessarily a security session, but you can't really talk about governance without talking about how we're going to govern data. So, and I love that you talked about some of the features that will be coming to Loop, because exactly Teams is one of these, that DLP, or data loss prevention, was not available for initially. It's something that we started to integrate right after Teams was out. But one of the cool things was for customers, we were able to go and say, hey, those DLP policies and rules that you have set up in place for Exchange and SharePoint, we just introduced a new checkbox for Teams. You don't have to go and have a total reinvention brainstorming session on how do we manage teams or anything like that. If it's as simple for your organization as, hey, we want to govern it the same as we would SharePoint, which generally happens a lot,
Yeah.
it's a checkbox. And in my opinion, it's always great when we can do that.
Yes.
And so here, again, I'm not going to go through all of the individual policies. We have a great preset. If I went and created a new policy here, it would allow us to pre-select from categories, so things like privacy or in the information space, healthcare, depending on, again, regional space. So these are not U.S.-oriented. These are global-oriented policies that we've worked with customers, large and small, understanding what are the most common policies you set up. But one of my favorite things to do, if you're ever bored for like 3 hours, is create a custom DLP policy. You could do a lot of really cool things where you're actually defining the sub-level rules of everything that happens. You can allow the granular level controls about whether an end user, when the pop-up says that, hey, you've sent something that is blocked, you can control that complete message in itself too. And what I'm alluding to is I will go over here and take a look at a chat with Megan Bowen. And you'll see here that I sent a credit card. I was trying to order some lunch, and I just didn't think about it. And I was like, hey, here's my credit card information. Order those pizzas. Let's get going. Not a good idea to share credit card information, right? It's also not a good idea to share credit card information in a SharePoint, or excuse me, a Word doc with a ton of files so we can be able to assess through it there. So this is a very just quick, obvious example of sharing something through DLP that it's going to catch. And then we can click on it, and here it's going to let the end user know why it was blocked. And we do feel this is extremely important. We want to let the end user know, like, hey, you didn't commit a violation. You're not in trouble. We just want to let you know that this is material that shouldn't be shared. Some cases, you might want to actually allow an override here, right? And that is something that, again, we get into those really fun, creative rules that you can customize yourself, that you can decide how your organization works. In this case, for credit cards, I don't want my Contoso users sharing it, so I'm going to let it be blocked. And if we feel like there's an error here, or maybe that this was a rare mismatch, that it thought it was a credit card and it wasn't, we can have it reported. It can go to the proper authorities is a strong word, but the proper admins to be able to triage this and take a look and say, oh, okay, this is what's going on, because permissions is always very important too, and who's able to access data like this when it's data governance, communication, compliance, et cetera. We want to make sure that we have the right roles and permissions that are able to make the right assessment. So again, very quick and kind of dirty view of DLP, but it is something that, again, works across your spectrum of Microsoft 365. It is not unique to Teams, to Exchange, to SharePoint, to Yammer, or anywhere else, in the sense that it's supposed to work across your ecosystem.
Correct. Now, of course, we're doing all of this fun stuff in a demonstration tenant, which means the perf is awesome. We can hop open all of the lists. There's no like waiting and going getting coffee because there's 100,000 teams in your tenant. So one of the skills that you need to have in this area, especially if you work in a larger organization, is PowerShell. You need PowerShell scripting capabilities. You need to understand the way PowerShell works. And so for me, I don't know how you all feel about this, but people talk a lot about low code, no code, pro developers, and what have you. I think some of the PowerShell scripts I've seen in my time are absolutely code, as far as I'm concerned. They are complicated. They have complicated syntax, and we have a community where you can learn some of the ins and outs of that. But you do need to configure it on your machine. You do have to be an admin of that tenant to be able to install those modules. This is another really good reason to have a pre-prod or a dev tenant that you can practice your scripting skills on. And I'm bringing that up also because the question that someone is asking is, will these B2B guest configurations be exposed for management via the Graph API? And most things you do in the Graph API, you often do in scripting. And so I'm going to let you answer that question, or we can share whatever you want.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so the Graph API continues to evolve. Some of the capabilities are there, but to be honest, I believe that some of the flags that you need to control some of those capabilities are missing. And so, we continue to put more and more into the Graph API because it is the center of gravity. It's the substrate, the place where all data in Microsoft 365 and beyond exists. And so if it's not there today, it will be in the future. But I actually believe some of these capabilities that we can automate, and that goes to automating user onboarding or guest onboarding. There's also also some lovely things called packages inside of Azure Active Directory that also allows you to write additional scripts. And I've seen many organizations also use Power Automate in their user onboarding process or their Teams deployment process. So there are ways to do this. So if you're looking to automate things, the answer is yes. Exactly where and how depends on your scenario and which policy or characteristic you're trying to get to in Graph API.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, good.
I'm being very mindful of time, and thank you, Marcus, for the question. So this is the last kind of demo screen I'm going to show here is around sensitivity labels. And this, again, is another item that goes across. Started in Office apps, applying a sensitivity label to a document, a functional spec, or whatever it may be. And this is something that was widely embraced by our community, our customers, and they have continually told us to build this out more and more and more and more. And so that's what we've done. And so I think it was about a year and a half ago, we introduced sensitivity labels into Teams. And so you can go through here, you can create a sensitivity label, and it's part of the menu, which I won't do. I'll show you the end user view. You had this new dropdown that included sites, groups, and then Microsoft Teams. And within Teams, you can help define privacy limits like guests, which is one of probably the most key assets, is when I apply a sensitivity label when creating a team, which I'll show you right here, is we can actually limit who's able to join that team when we apply that label. So again, same familiar labels that you're applying to a document or email even perhaps, like highly confidential, confidential are always the generic ones that we use. But within Microsoft, we have things, Microsoft confidential, highly confidential. Typically, organizations make these very customized based on how their org works. But the nice thing is, again, we don't want to reinvent labels. We don't want to have a bunch of different things that end users have to see and try and figure out what does this actually mean. We want consistency. And so if you are one of those orgs that has kind of the key area of 5 to 10 labels, when someone goes to create a new team, they can select a privacy level of private, public, org-wide, or they can use a pre-existing sensitivity label that you've created back from the old days of the Office apps, and you can apply it directly to the team. And once you select this label, it's automatically going to enforce that privacy policy, right? So anything Project Cortana, I can spin that team up. It's going to have the sensitivity label associated with this team, and it will make it only private. And so what that looks like from an end user view here is, I always have to find the right team, but it's going to be up here in your right-hand column of that the team has a sensitivity label applied to it. And now I'm going to have to click through a bunch of them. But instead of wasting time doing that, what I'm going to say is sensitivity labels are something that we're continuing to invest in. One of the recent things we did about 6 months ago or a year ago was we can actually have retention labels triggered off of sensitivity labels. So that coupling together there. We understood from customers that they were typically applying both. And so again, leveraging that automation, that work smarter, not harder. And so even if you are an E3 customer and you're using manual classifications of sensitivity labels, still a very key thing to start introducing to your organization, teaching them and understanding. Maybe you start with one label only, confidential, right? That's totally okay. Even if you're a 100,000 seat organization, you haven't started it yet, it's better to start with a small number of labels, and I would love your opinion on this, but start small, things that people can understand how to actually apply them. Otherwise, they're just not going to do so.
Exactly. Any drop down that has more than a few choices, people are just going to ignore. We learned this from all the way back when we were configuring PC docs instances back in the day in the legal industry, right? So people have this desire, people like myself want to capture a lot of information, have a lot of fields. People won't fill it out. They'll just go away, right? So if you're formed, or you're provisioning, instance tries to gather too much information, I think it's 17 seconds. I forgot the data point now, but we actually, have the number of seconds that it takes to lose someone. And it's not very long, right? So I love the idea of starting small and building on from there because it goes back to this best practice of involving your users and making sure to secure the data, using the automation capabilities. So a lot of the things that John just showed you, people were building into forms, right? You don't have to build it into the form. You can configure it right in Microsoft 365. Let us have the onus of maintaining that system for you. right? Save your custom coding time for things that actually matter to your business and let us handle the governance policies and capabilities. You just have to configure and deploy them. And then continue to give us feedback on what else you need us to build, right? Governance is an ever-evolving space, and the collaboration experience, having a successful collaboration experience is also really important. I'm going to flip back. Let's flip back to the deck, to the teamwork governance slide. So once again, I want you to visit this documentation, but also visit the Microsoft 365 community. You can find that at aka.ms Microsoft Community. That's our new front door we just launched at the show this week. But that's a group of IT pros, admins, and developers, people who know how to do PowerShell. Vesa Jovinen runs that community. He is spectacular. They have weekly calls. They have demonstrations. They have videos. Anything that you want to learn about this topic and so much more you can find there. You can also find it on Microsoft Learn, right? And so one of the things that we're trying to do better is help guide you through the phases of this with more, in a bit more smooth of a way. So we're continuing to invest in Microsoft Learn and our documentation around this. But don't let governance be the bane of your user adoption. Make sure that you're protecting your data and making relationships with the other business leaders in your organization. IT pros are superheroes. They really are. We're the ones who kept the lights on in many respects during the beginning of the pandemic. We're the ones who enable people to be successful. We just want to do it in secure ways. So now our challenge is to communicate with those business leaders a little bit differently so that they can understand the tremendous asset that all of you are in making sure that they have a great business. So I really appreciate, so many people here and online coming to this session at the end of the day. We really hope you had a fantastic Ignite, this wonderful experiment of a hybrid show. And, I hope that you did. And please, I hope to see you out in the community. Feel free to continue to ask us questions. John and I are out there all the time. This is one of our favorite subjects, and just really very much appreciate all of you. Thank you so much.